Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
That defense industry framework now coming in just days as Sweden is about to join NATO. So we thought who better to speak to than one of the biggest defense companies in Sweden, Saab. They, just as a reminder to everybody, they make submarines, they make ships, they make missiles, torpedoes, they make surveillance equipment, and of course those Gripen jets that were so key to Sweden joining NATO. So we're joined now by the CEO, Micael Johansson, the CEO of Saab, joining us here from Stockholm. Micael, I'd like to just start for you to just sort of quantify for us what's happening here in historic terms for Saab in terms of demand. You have huge amount of NATO wanting to hit its targets, a huge amount of military spending. Quantify for us the demand that Saab is seeing, and specifically, where are you seeing the demand in all of the hardware that you offer?
Well, good morning. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a huge wake-up call for many countries in Europe since the tragic war started in Ukraine, of course. So the two last years have been completely different than earlier in terms of capacity need and investments that we're doing to increase capacity. And it starts with weapon systems, ammunition, surveillance equipment to create situation awareness. So that part of our business has been booming the last 2 years in terms of growth. And the whole company did grow 23% last year. So it's been much about capacity increases. Unfortunately, we started that investment before the war actually started because we saw a market trend in growing that part. So we've doubled once and we're doubling again. So next year we will have quadrupled the output on the support weapon side and ammunition side. So lots of things are happening right now.
Yeah, and sticking here from what we heard from Vestager and the other commissioners yesterday from Brussels in terms of the new defense strategy, what did you make of what we heard? And do you think that it's right to sort of centralize more of this activity in Brussels?
I welcome sort of incentives and initiatives which are incentive-driven to align requirements, to make countries collaborate, and by that also industries to boost capacity. And what EU has is, of course, a financial strength to do that. So if you put enough money into an EDIP fund like that, and you have a view of creating more sovereign capacity in Europe, I really welcome that. And I think that will drive less fragmentation going forward.
Micael, good morning. It's Guy in London. Donald Trump won Super Tuesday convincingly last night. It looks like he's going to be the Republican candidate in the U.S. election that is upcoming in November. Were he to return to the White House, how much more do you think Europe would need to do in terms of A, defense spending, and B, sourcing that defense spending from home, from domestic sources? Do you think there would be a greater refocusing on domestic sources?
Absolutely, and I see that trend already, that we have sort of woken up to realize that maybe the dependency on the U.S. is much too big. I'm not saying that the transatlantic link is not important. It is really important, but the balance is wrong today. I mean, we had a year with spending from EU, which is 78% of all the defense spendings went outside EU. The majority of that, 80% to the US, 13% to Korea, and a few percent to Israel. So, of course, we have to change that sort of balance. It should be the opposite. It should be sort of 70% sovereign capacity in Europe and maybe 30% sort of external provisioning of defense capabilities. But that will take time. But I think this European defense industry strategy is sort of putting that in that direction now. So I welcome that as well. I think that's absolutely necessary.
Micael, how durable do you think this new attitude towards defense spending will be? If we were to see peace in Ukraine, if that conflict were to end, do you think there would be an expected peace dividend to come from that? Or do you think that this new thinking is stickier than that it will be more durable, that the Russian threat will be seen as a longer-term threat to Europe?
Well, I think it will be durable. I mean, only looking at the projections from independent sources on the defense spending over the next decade from European countries, that increased by $500 billion from January 23 to January 24 in terms of projection in the next decade. I have a hard time seeing that if we hopefully win the war in Ukraine and we get peace, just sort of let the guard down again and hope that nothing will happen, having Russia as a neighbor for decades to be not trusted, I don't think that's possible. So I think this is a long-term trend that we need to increase our deterrence, our stockpiles, our capabilities in Europe. That's my view.
And in terms of strategic dependence, we talked about the United States. Is it more difficult now, just given the concern about sort of the military industry, about who you do business with? And I'd also like to get a sense for you, because you really have a good understanding of this, is how dependent is the European defense industry, broadly speaking, on its materials, on its supply chain? And specifically, I'm thinking about China.
Well, I think we need to do more on the ecosystem, on the supply chain part. I think we are going in the direction of regionalizing that, so we have resilient supply chains. I don't see a huge dependence on China when it comes to our defense capabilities or defense technologies, actually, but there are sort of course, resilience to be created. So that's a big movement in every company to make sure that we have much more resilient supply chains than we had before the war, not only because Ukraine, but also the effect on transport channels and what happens if you, I mean, also the pandemic started that initiative to make supply chains more resilient going forward. But I don't see a big dependence on China in this area.
And I think obviously the war in Ukraine has taught a lot of people a lot of things versus the expectation of what war looks like and the reality of what war looks like. One of the really great disruptors, I think, of the defense industry and how war is waged are drones. And I'm concerned, I'd like to know from you, how are you dealing with drones in terms of dealing with detecting drones? You obviously make also very expensive hardware that can be potentially knocked out by something that is very inexpensive at high volume. How are you dealing with the threat of drones?
I think many companies, including ours, are working solutions to have counter-UAS, unmanned air systems, sort of with sort of efficient measures to do. We have lots of sensor equipment to detect drones in all domains, but the effector part and the mobility of things is the important factor. And there are solutions, absolutely, to this, but there are more to come, I think, in this area, because drones will be there in the future, and they will be integrated with more sophisticated systems as well and be used in the battlefield. So you're right. I mean, counter-UAS is a very, very important area going forward.
Micael, let's go from the fighting to the financing. Do you think Europe should jointly finance its defense spending? Do you think we could see something similar to what we saw in the pandemic? Do you think there should be common bonds issued in order to make sure that this ramp up is ultimately delivered?
I think it is important that the defense industry have the same sort of possibilities to attract capital as any other type of business. So what I would welcome is, of course, that the big funds is also investing in defense industries. And a big signal would, of course, be if the European Investment Bank would change their policy in terms of not only investing in dual-use technology, but also in defense technology. That would send a big signals to the large funds to also put capital into the defense industry. I would like that.
Do you think this risk represents something similar, akin to, we should think of it like what is happening with climate? Europe has become very good at thinking cross-border when it comes to the climate story. What lessons do you think need to be learned from that in terms of thinking about how we deal with the new defense threats? We're in a different era, a different post-Cold War era. What do you think we need to be doing differently in terms of the way that we think about Europe and its defense industry and how it is ultimately financed?
Well, I think that we have to realize that this is a paradigm shift. I mean, we come from a peace perspective of things, and we have lots to do to increase deterrence and resilience and stockpiles. I think the incentives that are being placed now by the European Commission are absolutely right. I mean, we're not the United States of Europe. There's national sovereignty when it comes to defense and security, and it has to be a balance. But if countries can come together to align requirements, and there is money available to support that from all the member states into this EDIP fund, of course, that will drive alignment. It will drive possibly also consolidation in Europe going forward. And that's the way we should go, I think. These are the right initiatives, surely.
Micael, great to see you. Thank you for joining us. Really useful conversation. Micael Johansson, the CEO of Saab, and of course our thanks to Ollie Crook joining us from Brussels.